On a routine earnings call in early May 2023, a CEO said something that should not have been possible. Students were leaving, not slowly, not gradually, instantly. Traffic gone. Subscriptions collapsing. Demand evaporating in real time. The explanation sounded almost casual, almost harmless. Students were using AI. Within hours, the market erased nearly half the company's value. In the months that followed, what had once been a $13 billion business began to disintegrate. Not because it failed to grow, not because it was mismanaged, but because the thing it sold stopped being scarce. For 20 years, this company had built itself into a gatekeeper of answers. Homework solutions, step-by-step explanations, a quiet toll booth between confusion and clarity. A student in 2018 would sit at a desk at 2014 a.m., laptop glowing, typing in a calculus problem. The answer was not free. It sat behind a subscription. $14.95 a month. Pay or struggle. That friction, that small barrier, was the entire business. Now imagine the same student in 2023. Same desk, same problem, same panic, but this time there is no paywall. No delay, no search, no expert on the other side of the world. Just a blinking cursor and an answer that arrives instantly. Not found, generated. The difference is subtle, but economically it is terminal. Because if an answer can be generated infinitely at near zero cost, then the market price of that answer does not fall. It collapses. And when the price collapses, so does everything built on top of it. This is not a story about one company. This is a forensic record of what happens when an entire business model is built on something that can suddenly be created for free. And by the time most people recognize the pattern, their income is already inside it. Before it collapsed, the system looked almost benevolent. In 2005, Chegg was not an AI casualty. It was a textbook rental company, a simple response to a very real problem. College textbooks in the United States were becoming unaffordable. A single biology book could cost $200. Students were not choosing between brands. They were choosing between eating and passing. Chegg entered quietly with a promise. Rent the book instead of buying it. It felt efficient, fair, even. A student orders a textbook for $40 instead of $180. It arrives in a cardboard box. Highlight it, use it, return it. The model spread quickly across campuses. By 2010, it was no longer just a service. It was infrastructure. But this was only the first layer, because renting books did not solve the real problem. It only delayed it. The real pain was not access to textbooks. It was understanding them, and that is where the second business emerged, the one that would eventually become the entire company. Chegg Study, a subscription product, roughly $15 per month, unlimited access to solved problems. Step-by-step breakdowns, answers to questions students were stuck on at 1:30 a.m. when no professor was answering emails. At first, the supply was small, a few thousand solutions, then tens of thousands, then millions. Behind the scenes, something more industrial was forming, an invisible workforce, heavily concentrated in India, solving problems at scale. Math, physics, chemistry, engineering. A global assembly line of expertise. By 2020, Chegg had built a database of over 70 million solved questions. 70 million. Each one a small piece of confusion converted into clarity and locked behind a paywall. This was the moat. Not technology, not brand, volume. If you asked a question, there was a high probability someone had already asked it, and Chegg had the answer. And if the answer already existed, it could be sold again. And again, and again. This is how the illusion forms. It begins to look like knowledge is being created, but in reality, it is being collected, indexed, and resold. The company scaled, revenue grew, margins expanded, investors rewarded the model. By 2021, the valuation approached $13 billion. On paper, it looked like a knowledge empire, but underneath, it depended on a single fragile assumption, that answers were hard to produce. That assumption held for nearly 2 decades, until, suddenly, it didn't. To understand why this collapse was so fast, you have to understand what Chegg was really selling. Not answers. Friction. Think about a student in 2016 trying to solve a differential equation. They open a textbook. Dense symbols. No intuition, just steps. They go to Google. 10 blue links. Forums. PDFs. Half answers. Contradictions. Time passes. Stress builds. This is where Chegg inserted itself. Not as a creator of knowledge, but as a remover of delay. It compressed hours into seconds. That compression had value. And more importantly, it had price. Here is the economic structure. Stripped down. Input, a difficult question. Friction. Time. Confusion. Search cost. Solution, pre-solved answer. Output, relief. Chegg monetized the gap between confusion and clarity. The wider the gap, the more valuable the bridge. Now look at how they scaled it. They did not need to solve new problems every time. They needed to solve problems once, then store them. A calculus problem solved in 2018 could be resold in 2019, 2020, 2021. Infinite resale. Near zero marginal cost. This is the same logic as a digital music file or movie stream. But there is a critical difference. Music is scarce because of taste. Answers are scarce because of effort. And effort, unlike taste, can be automated. That distinction is where the entire system breaks. Because once effort is automated, the archive loses its power. Imagine you run a toll bridge across a river. For 20 years, people pay to cross. Then, one morning, the river disappears. Not narrowed, not diverted. Gone. That is what generative AI did to Chegg's core asset. It did not compete with the database. It made the database irrelevant, because the student no longer needed to find an answer that already existed. They could generate a new one, instantly tailored to their exact question, even if that question had never been asked before. This is a deeper shift than most people realize. Search is retrieval. AI is synthesis. Search depends on the past. AI operates in the present. And economically, that destroys any model built on stored answers. Here's the pattern. Interrupt. If you can find it on Google, it's worth something. If it's behind a paywall, it's worth more. But if AI can generate it on demand, it trends toward zero. Not because it lacks value, but because it lacks scarcity. And markets do not pay for abundance. They pay for constraint. This is why Chegg could not defend itself by simply adding AI. Because adding AI to a friction-based model is like installing a machine that removes the need for your own product. You accelerate your own collapse. And internally, they understood this. Because the moment students realized they could bypass the archive entirely, the behavioral shift was immediate. No transition period. No gradual decline. Just a silent migration away from paid answers to generated ones. And once a user learns that something can be free, charging for it again becomes almost impossible. The collapse did not begin with a product launch. It began with a sentence. On May 1, 2023, during an earnings call, the CEO of Chegg said something that investors had not priced in. New user growth was slowing. Because students were turning to AI tools like ChatGPT, there was no dramatic tone, no panic in the delivery, just a quiet admission. But the market understood immediately. This was not competition. This was substitution. Within hours, the stock dropped nearly 50%. Not a correction, a repricing of reality. Because investors suddenly saw what had been invisible, Chegg did not own its users. It rented their desperation. In the moment a cheaper, faster solution appeared, that loyalty vanished. No contracts, no switching costs, no friction left to monetize. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. Traffic declined. Subscriber growth reversed. Guidance was cut. But the real collapse was behavioral. Imagine you are a second-year engineering student. Last semester, you paid for Chegg. It helped. You passed. This semester, your friend shows you something new. You paste a problem into ChatGPT. It doesn't just give you the answer. It explains it. You ask a follow-up question. It adapts. You ask again. It refines. There is no limit, no meter, no cost. You don't cancel Chegg because you're dissatisfied. You cancel because it no longer makes sense to pay for something that feels obsolete. This is how systems break now. Not through failure, through irrelevance. And internally, the company faced an impossible decision. If they integrated AI deeply, they would destroy the pricing model that sustained them. If they didn't, users would leave anyway. This is the classic trap described decades earlier, but rarely this clean in execution. The moment innovation makes your core product unnecessary, you are no longer competing in a market. You are exiting it, and by the time the earnings call ended, that exit had already begun. The collapse of a business model always looks clean on a chart. A sharp drop, a new equilibrium. Analysts move on, but on the ground, it is not clean. It is uneven, quiet, personal, because when the price of something falls to zero, the cost does not disappear. It moves. Start with the workforce that made the system possible. Tens of thousands of contract experts, many based in India, were solving problems manually. A physics equation, a chemistry balance, a statistics proof. Each answer paid a small fee. A few dollars per solution. Volume made it viable. For years, this invisible labor force converted human effort into structured knowledge. Then, almost overnight, demand weakened, not because the work became less valuable, but because it became replaceable. The system did not need them anymore. Now, shift to the students. On the surface, they won. Answers became free, instant, unlimited, but something else changed. When answers are purchased, they are consumed carefully. When answers are free, they are used differently, faster, more casually, often without verification. The student no longer waits, no longer struggles in the same way. The friction that once forced understanding is removed, and in its place, something more subtle appears, dependence. Because when the answer is always available, the incentive to build internal models weakens. This is not universal. Some adapt, some go deeper, but many do not. Now consider the investors. At its peak, Chegg's valuation reflected predictable cash flows from subscription, recurring revenue, high margins, scalable content. On paper, it looked durable, but that durability depended on a condition that was never explicitly priced, that the cost of generating answers would remain high. When that cost collapsed, the valuation did not gradually adjust. It snapped. This is the pattern. When a system is built on scarcity, and that scarcity is removed, the losses do not distribute evenly. They concentrate. Workers lose income. Companies lose pricing power. Investors lose capital. Users gain convenience, but often at the cost of something harder to measure. And the architects of the system, they rarely absorb the full impact. They exit early, diversify, move on to the next structure. The question is not whether free is good or bad. The question is, who is paying for it? And what are they losing in return? The collapse of Chegg is not the end of an industry. It is the removal of a layer, the layer that charged for answers. And when a layer disappears, the system does not stop. It reorganizes. To see where value moves next, you have to isolate what AI cannot easily replace. Not knowledge, not explanation, not even speed. Those are now abundant. What remains scarce is something far less visible. Judgment under uncertainty. Consider two students again. Both have access to ChatGPT. Both can generate answers instantly, but one of them asks better questions, challenges the output, cross-checks assumptions, understands when the answer is wrong. That difference is no longer academic. It is economic. Because in a world of infinite answers, the bottleneck shifts from access to interpretation. This is the new currency. Not, do you know the answer? But, do you know what to do with it? Can you detect when a model is hallucinating? Can you translate an answer into a real-world decision where stakes exist? Money, safety, reputation. Because outside of a homework problem, answers are not self-contained. They interact with reality, and reality punishes errors. This is where most people misread the shift. They believe AI replaces skill. In reality, it compresses baseline skill and amplifies the consequences of poor judgment. The floor rises. The ceiling disappears. Now extend this beyond students. Law, finance, medicine, engineering, any field where value is tied to retrieving and presenting information is exposed. Not eliminated, but repriced. The individuals who survive this transition are not the ones who know more. They are the ones who can decide better with the same information, who can operate when the answer is incomplete, contradictory, or context-dependent. This is slower, harder to scale, impossible to automate cleanly, which is exactly why it retains value. So the survival protocol is not a list of tools. It is a shift in posture. Stop positioning yourself as the source of answers. Position yourself as the filter, the interpreter, the one who can stand between infinite information and real-world consequences, and choose correctly, because the system has already changed. And from this point forward, there are only two positions left. You either sell something that can be generated for free, or you become the reason someone knows what to trust.